Hello there, my name is Liam Olds and I'm an entomologist based in South Wales, and I run a conservation initiative called the Colliery Spoil Biodiversity Initiative, which is all about raising awareness of the important biodiversity value of former colliery spoil sites in the South Wales valleys. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about colliery spoil sites and why they're particularly important for wildlife. And I should just state that all the images used are my own unless I state otherwise as well. So just by way of an overview of the talk, I'm just going to introduce the term colliery spoil for those that are unfamiliar with it. I'm just going to talk briefly about the South Wales coalfield, which is the area that I live in, the history of coal mining in the region and how the landscape has changed as a result. I'm also going to talk about what makes these colliery spoil sites particularly valuable for wildlife, with a particular emphasis on invertebrates. Going to look at some of the habitats that are present, the invertebrate species that you get on these sites, as well as some of the plants and fungi and other groups as well. And then touch on the threats facing these sites and why we really should be doing more to conserve them as well. So what is colliery spoil? So colliery spoil is simply the waste material that's been left over from coal extraction. So many regions of the British Isles have a long history of coal mining. That's the case in sort of South Wales as it is in North Wales, northeast of England, Yorkshire, central belt of Scotland and so forth. And a lot of this coal extraction was deep coal mining. And as the miners were underground getting at the coal seams, there was a lot of other waste material that they had to extract to get at the coal. And this material was tipped in the landscape, often on the valley tops or valley sides, to form what we call colliery spoil tips. And these contain various things, but particularly various sedimentary rocks like shale and ironstone. They contain fragments of coal as well. Various materials from demolished buildings. So when colliery buildings were demolished, that material was often thrown into the spoil tips as well. So it can be things like concrete and bricks. And then various other things as well, like old tram carts and rails and other things like that as well. So there's many regions in the British Isles that have a long history of deep coal mining. In South Wales, it was a very dominant industry, and is estimated to be 1,200 of these colliery spoil sites in South Wales alone. And I'm sure there's many other regions as well that have large numbers of these sites. Just a bit of a brief history of coal mining in South Wales. So as Britain began to industrialise itself, there was this growing demand for coal, which produced the steam power upon industry depended. So this brought about this huge boom in the South Wales coal industry, as it did elsewhere. And at its peak, the industry employed about 232,000 men, women and children in 620 coal mines across South Wales. And with all of this employment, as a result, it sort of brought in a lot of people to the area. So there was this huge influx of people from elsewhere in Wales, so particularly the west of Wales, but also parts of England like Cornwall, Somerset, and so forth, particularly the southwest of England, but also from Scotland, Ireland, and elsewhere in Europe as well, like France and Russia and Spain and Italy. And between 1851 and 1911, an estimated 366,000 people moved into the South Wales coalfield. And quite interestingly, during this time, South Wales was absorbing immigrants at a faster rate than anywhere else in the world apart from the United States. So as you can imagine, with this huge influx in people and the associated industries as well, there was huge environmental changes as a result. And if you look back at old OS maps, it can tell you quite a lot about these environmental changes. And here's an OS map of the Rhondda valleys around sort of 1875. And the Rhondda valleys are probably the most famous of the South Wales mining valleys. So really, really famous for the intense industry that was present in this area. And here you've got the Rhondda Fawr, which is the larger of the Rhondda valleys, going up on the left, and then the Rhondda Fach, which is the smaller of the Rhondda valleys, going up on the right. So in about 1851, the population of the Rhondda was less than 2,000, so it was very much very rural, and a lot of farms, and very little in the way of anything else, really. As you can see here, at this time in about 1875, there's a little bit of the coal mine industry just starting, so you can notice some of the terraced housing on the left there, but otherwise it's very rural. And if you just keep a close eye on the woodlands on the right there, heading up the Fach Valley, you can see you've got almost a continuous band of what would have been sessile oak woodland heading up the valley, almost just a continuous belt. And if you sort of keep an eye on that block of woodland and then jump forward to around the time of the Second World War, you can see that woodland is almost entirely gone. So you can see the dramatic impact that this coal industry had, particularly with the loss of ancient woodland habitat. But you can also see now by this period in time how extensive the terraced housing is to support the coal miners. And you can also see the telltale signs of the coal mining industry through the tramways that you can see going up on the valley sides there, and the telltale signs of the spoil tips as well. So you can see that the coal industry had a very dramatic change on the landscape of the South Wales coalfield, and from the population of just less than 2,000 in 1851 in the Rhondda, the population by 1911 had jumped to 152,781. So very dramatic changes in the number of people that live in there, and with all the housing and the railways and the colliery buildings and the spoil tips and stuff, it was obviously a very ecologically damaging industry. And the spoil, with just the waste material left over from that coal extraction, was discarded on the valley tops and valley sides, and has become an iconic feature in the landscape of the South Wales valleys. As you can see here, some of them are very dramatic. So here you've got the three pyramids of Llanbradach, and just north of Caerphilly, which are very, very dramatic in the way they look. And a lot of these sites were unfortunately removed, particularly in the 70s and 80s and the 90s as well. But a few of them have managed to survive, and quite a fair few actually, considering how many we got in South Wales. We're quite lucky that a good proportion have survived. And those that did survive have undergone this really incredible transformation. So they've gone from these black eyesores in the landscape just a few decades ago to these really fantastic wildlife habitats, which is the reason I'm talking to you today. And just some of the habitats you get on these sites are things like these absolutely fantastic flower-rich grasslands. So as you can see here, this is one of the sites near to where I live in Rhondda, and you can see just wall-to-wall grasslands full of wildflowers. So these colliery sites are some of the most flower-rich habitats within South Wales. And as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the loss of flower-rich grassland and the scale of the loss in the UK, which is estimated to be well over 97% since the 1940s. So having these flower-rich grasslands within the landscape is probably more important than ever at the moment. So you can see how valuable sites like these would be to pollinated insects like bees and butterflies and so forth. So flower-rich grasslands are one of the really key habitats on these sites. And here is just that same grassland at a different time of year. So in the previous slide, that was pictured when the kidney vetch was flowering. And here is later in the year where you've got a lot of the umbellifers, so things like the ragworts and pignut, and wild carrot and so forth. But you can see just how floristically rich these grasslands are on these colliery spoil sites. This is a very different sort of grassland, but again, rather rich, largely in terms of birds, common birds for trefoil here. So that's the yellow flower on the ground there. You can see how abundant it is, and it's a fantastic plant for a whole host of different invertebrates, and I'll come on to later. Get some really nice heathland habitats as well, particularly on those spoil tips that are situated on like the valley tops at higher altitude. So real nice sort of dry heathland communities. Also get some lichen heath habitat, which is a bit of a more unique sort of habitat found on these colliery spoil sites. So this is where the nice open ground conditions really favour lichens as well as mosses and liverworts as well. But you can see these large clumps of cladonia lichens here, which are really thriving, where they're sort of not outcompeted by grasses and other plant species. So these lichen heath communities are really distinctive of colliery spoil sites in South Wales as well. You've got another nice example here of another really good example of a heathland, a nice dry heathland habitat. Various sort of wetlands as well, so these can be simply little boggy pools, and here you've got a bit of a boggy pool that doesn't look much to look at, but it's got sphagnum mosses in it, so it's sort of replicating bog pools, which is quite a special thing about these sites, is their ability to replicate a huge variety of different habitats. Here you can see a nice display of cotton grass, which is another plant species that you'd associate with peatland habitats or bogs. So you can see how they have this ability to replicate those sort of habitats. Vary in other sort of wetlands as well, so things like, the case here is sort of quite a large lake. Also you can have sort of seasonal pools, ponds, ditches, and also reed beds. So we quite commonly get reed beds on these colliery spoil sites, but in exceptional circumstances, like pictured here, you can have very large reed bed systems, which are important for a variety of wildlife, particularly birds, but also aquatic invertebrates as well. And you can just see, this is just a top-down view of this particular reed bed. You can see the sort of scale of it here, which is actually the largest reed bed within the county of Rhondda and Taff here. This is all former colliery site. Probably one of the most special and rare sort of habitats on these sites are these tufa springs. So these are waters that are rich in calcium that are leaching out the side of the tip, and they're depositing calcium carbonate at the surface, which we call tufa. And these very calcium-rich waters support some specialist mosses that really like those high calcium sort of conditions. And then in those sort of mosses live specialist soldier flies, which are very restricted in their sort of distribution. And you can also get some very specialist crane flies as well around these tufa springs. This is probably the rarer sort of habitat you get on these sites within South Wales, and really quite a special feature that was only really discovered in the last few years. You can get woodland on these sites. Generally, they tend to be very treeless because they're very harsh environments, and trees really struggle to take a foothold. But you can get trees, and some sites can be very wooded, and you get some rather nice, albeit rather young, sort of birch woodland. But you can also get some nice wet woodlands as well as some nice bits of oak as well. So it can be quite varied in the tree species that colonize these sites. And of course, bare ground is one of the key sort of habitats on these sites, and it's a habitat that's really overlooked for its wildlife value, particularly for invertebrates. But these sort of areas of bare ground are really important for a number of specialist butterflies that need the higher temperatures provided by the bare ground, but also as sort of nesting areas for things like solitary bees and solitary wasps, and as sort of visual sort of hunting areas. So some nice open areas of bare ground that spiders and ground beetles can use to use their good vision to hunt for prey as well. But what makes these sites particularly valuable to wildlife is their diversity. So they're really varied in terms of their topography. So as you can imagine, the coal miners weren't particularly creating these tips in a very sort of neat and standardized way. So they were just tipped in the landscape as and where was appropriate. So this topography is really quite key to the ecological values of these sites. And as a result of this varied topography, you get these varied aspects. You get north, south, east, and west, and all the associated micro climates that result from that. The substrate itself can vary quite a lot, even across a single site. So there might be some areas where the spoil is composed of certain rocks, and in other areas where those rocks might be different. The material might be friable in some locations, or it might be quite coarse in other locations. All of this affects the pH as well as the hydrology as well. So there might be areas where the soil is very free draining, so you get nice sort of dry heathland and dry grassland communities developing there, or it might be quite compacted, and that's where you get your wetland habitats developing. And the level of disturbance also varies across and between sites as well. So some sites might be regularly used by things like off-road motorcyclists, others might not. But effectively, all of these different things sort of add up to create these really complex habitat mosaics. And that's really what's key behind the ecological values of these sites is this open mosaic of habitats within close proximity. And that's really important for a lot of the invertebrates, as many require 2 or more habitats to complete their life cycle. They're also really valuable because they're relatively undisturbed. So even when you look at nature reserves, for instance, they can have a lot of pressure when it comes to things like dog walking and other things. So, but these particular sites, they don't tend to be that well used by local communities. Sometimes they are, but sometimes, quite often, they're not. So they tend to be relatively undisturbed. A lot of what's there has just come naturally. So it's just the natural sea blank and natural fauna that have managed to get to that site and colonize. And they don't have any management at all, which is bad in some respects, but good in other respects, as it allows nature to do what it wants to do, as it sees best, pretty much. And then another key point really that makes these sites really valuable is the nutrient poor soils. So this sort of creates sort of stressed ground conditions. It stops a lot of dominant plant species like coarse grasses from taking over. So it really promotes species diversity, particularly within the flora, which then is passed on to the invertebrates and other things as well. So nutrient poor soils is really quite key to why these sites are so floristically rich. And I started back in January 2015 looking at these in a sort of professional capacity. Now, I've always been interested in these sites in my sort of early teens when I first started to discover wildlife, but I started to look at these on a much larger scale as part of a traineeship called the Natural Talent Traineeship Scheme. And this was run by the Conservation Volunteers and funded by the Esmere Fairbairn Foundation. Unfortunately, the scheme has now come to an end, but it was a fantastic scheme that was all about getting the next generation of naturalists. It was all about, they sort of recognized that there was a skills gaps within the conservation sector with regard to certain taxonomic groups. And one of those was entomology, which was the sort of scheme that I was on. I was based in the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff. And as part of that, I had a research project, and I was looking at the invertebrates of Colliery Spoil sites, because these sort of sites were seen as quite an iconic Welsh habitat. So I started to research them and look at the invertebrate communities on them, and the results were so promising then that I founded my conservation initiative back at the end of sort of 2015, and then managed to sort of work then freelance the rest of the time. And I managed to get some funding from Rhondda and Taff County Borough Council, which is my local council, to look at sites within my county borough for 2 years. And then an adjacent county borough, Newport Talbot as well, also funded me for another 2 years to do the same in that county borough. And I've been working a bit with Bridgend County Borough Council in 2020 as well. And my initial research sort of found over 900 different species of invertebrate. So quite a good diversity. We didn't really know a lot about these sites because no one had really looked at the invertebrates in any detail beyond some of the butterflies and some of the dragonflies. So it sort of has proven that they do support a diverse invertebrate fauna. This is literally just the sort of baseline, really, and we know that there's still huge numbers of species to be found in all of the groups that we've looked at. I started with no background in entomology at all, so it's been quite a steep learning curve. and is every year that I'm in entomology, the more species I can identify, and I'm sure, yeah, there's many more to be found here. So yeah, so it's important not to take the number of 901 quite literally, because any experienced entomologist will know that you could get, you know, easily several hundred species on a single site, you know, just on a single day. But yeah, it does reflect the diversity on these sites. Perhaps the most important thing is that about 20% of all of those species were found to be of conservation importance. So these are species that are localized, scarce, rare, or red data book listed. So these are some of our rarest, most threatened species. So it does show that these sites are supporting some of our rarest and most scarce species within the UK. And when you look at it in the Welsh context as well, that's often even more significant as well. But you can see there's a diversity of insects there on the left. So you've got your Coleoptera, your beetles, Diptera, which are your flies, your Hemiptera, which are your true bugs, Hymenoptera, which are bees, wasps, and ants, Lepidoptera, which are your butterflies and dayfly and moths, and then Ordinata, which are your dragonflies, Orthoptera, which are your grasshoppers and crickets, and then Dermaptera, which are your earwigs. And then also, as well as the insects, like I just mentioned, there's also a variety of other groups that I've looked at, non-insect invertebrates, so things like spiders, centipedes, millipedes, woodlice, slugs and snails, and a few others as well. So none of these groups have been really looked in huge detail. I'd say the ones that have probably had the most work are the solitary bees and the bumblebees, which are my main area of interest. And the centipedes and millipedes have also had quite a bit of work. So they've probably got the ones that have been best reflected. But these figures are somewhat outdated now, and these probably the figures well over 1,000 and increasing. But I'm just going to kind of guide you through some of the sort of iconic species that you get on these sites, some of the more interesting species, attractive species, interesting species, and hopefully you'll enjoy kind of this. So starting with the butterflies, so 28 butterfly species have so far been recorded on these colliery sites in South Wales. So included among these are things like the dingy skipper. So dingy skipper is a really beautiful butterfly. It doesn't quite live up to its name of dingy, a really attractive thing. It's considered a priority species for conservation within the UK. It has undergone a widespread decline. And it's a species that favours bare ground, so it needs common birds for trefoil, but next to areas of bare ground. So it needs the higher temperatures that are provided by these areas of bare ground. So with lots of bare ground on these colliery sites, and also they are very rich in common birds for trefoil, dingy skipper tends to be one of the most common butterflies that you find on these sites, particularly when you sort of go in sort of May time when this species is active. Another sort of standout species is the grayling butterfly. So this is another one that does really well on these colliery sites in South Wales. Another priority species for conservation, another one that's undergone a widespread decline. It also needs areas of bare ground. Its larvae feed on grasses, but it needs those next to bare ground for the higher temperatures, again, for the larval development. And they've got these wonderful mottled underwings. And when it tucks its sort of orangey forewing underneath the hind wing, these butterflies almost disappear when they're on the bare ground. They're absolutely amazing camouflage. Also get some, on a few sites, some very specialist butterflies, so things like the small blue butterfly. So this is, well, what is quite a rare butterfly within Wales, and usually found on the coastal sand dunes, but it has colonised a number of colliery sites in my county borough, Rhondda and Taff, where it feeds on kidney vetch. So one of the earliest slides I had an amazing display of kidney vetch. That's a site that supports a small blue butterfly, and the small blue butterfly is our smallest resident UK butterfly. Also get some really nice fritillary butterflies as well. So particularly the small pill-bordered fritillary, which is pictured here, which feeds on violets, and you tend to find these in the sort of the damper areas of these colliery spoil sites. But also dark green fritillary, which is a bit more common, and also as have been found this year, pearl-bordered fritillary as well, which is one that I wouldn't normally associate with colliery spoil sites, but I have managed to find that on one colliery spoil site this year. Also some rather nice moths. So the forester moth is quite a rare moth within Glamorgan in South Wales, and this has turned up in 2020 in quite good numbers on one particular site just north of Cardiff. And I'm hopeful that they're going to be present on other colliery spoil sites in the region as well. So it's one to really keep an eye out for, but a really attractive looking moth. The six-belted clearwing moth is probably the most iconic moth that I would think of on colliery spoil sites. So it's another one that feeds on common birds with trefoil, which is a very abundant plant on these sort of sites. So usually on sort of nice warm summer's day, you'll see little clouds of these six-belted clearwings all sort of flying around above the common birds with trefoil, which is an amazing thing to see. Bees have been particularly interesting, and as I mentioned, this is sort of the group that has probably received the most work, because this is the group that I sort of specialise in. And I've recorded well, over 90 different species of bee now, which equates to about a third of the UK fauna, about half the Welsh fauna. So pretty good just for a small number of sites within my local area. And a number of these are uncommon species, so localised, scarce, rare, rare data book listed or equivalent things in Wales as well. With some of the sort of the best colliery spoil sites supporting sort of in the region of 50 to 60 different bee species, but even these, there's probably a lot more species to be found even on these sites as well. So really important for wild bee conservation. Quite ironically, the vast majority of these bees are mining bees, so there is still mining going on in the South Wales valleys. But as well as the mining bees, there's also a plethora of other sort of solitary bees as well. So things like nomad bees and furrow bees and blood bees and leafcutter bees and so forth. So really fantastic places for solitary bees. But also bumblebees do really well. So there's 15 species of bumblebee that's been found on these sites, which is pretty good considering we've only got 24 UK species, which includes a number of priority species as well. And of course the one honeybee species as it is across the whole of Europe. Just going through just some of those bees. So one of those is Andrena coetana, or small flex mining bee, which has turned up on a number of these colliery spoil sites that I've surveyed. This is a very localized species, so if you look at its distribution, it's very patchy throughout the whole of the UK. So it's been a real nice species to find on these sort of sites, and it really sort of likes these yellow asteraceae flowers that tend to be quite numerous on these colliery spoil sites. Another one is Andrena humilis, or the capsule mining bee. So as its name suggests, this is a species that forages heavily on capsule. So as again, sort of those asteraceae coming into kind of showing the importance of these yellow asteraceae. This is another nationally scarce species. The tormentor mining bee is one that's probably one of the more iconic solitary bees on these sites. So I've managed to find it on quite a number of different colliery spoil sites now. And this is another species that's considered nationally scarce and a priority for conservation in the UK. It's undergone a widespread decline. And its name suggests it forages on tormentor flowers. You tend to find these on the sort of the heath covered coal tips, is where you particularly find these. Also a number of bumblebees, as I mentioned. So things like the brown-banded carder bee, Bombus humilis, which is another nationally scarce species, does particularly well in South Wales, but it is sort of less common than the common carder bumblebee. But it does really love these colliery spoil sites. It really loves the legume-rich grasslands and also the hotter conditions that are found on these sites. And probably my favourite invertebrate of all, the bilberry bumblebee. It's a really nice species to see on these colliery sites. It loves the heath-covered coal tips, but it also uses a variety of other plants on these sites as well. So when the bilberry stops flowering, you'll often see them foraging on things like common birch or trefoil, but also thistles and bramble and other things as well. But an absolutely stunning species that's rather localized and unfortunately in decline. Get some nice wasps as well. So the red-banded sand wasp is probably the most sort of attractive looking of the wasp species you get on these sites. And these are quite large wasps that hunt caterpillars, particularly of heathland associated moths. So it's really nice to see these things fly around. with caterpillars, and then sort of taking them to their nest chamber and things like that. In terms of beetles, the green tiger beetle is probably the one that you're most likely to see if you get out on these colliery spoil sites in South Wales. So absolutely beautiful looking things. So that emerald green colour, large eyes, large jaws, quite long legs, quite fast running visual predators, and hunting other things on the open bare ground. But they really love the elevated temperatures that you get on these sites. They like the hot conditions, but they also like that bare ground because they've got the hunting platform to be able to look for prey. And the larvae can also be found as well, so they like those areas of open bare ground, and they have these circular burrows, and the larvae, as you can see here, with those almost circular heads, so they sit within the burrow, and they act as a bit of a pitfall trap, so things fall into the hole, and then the green tiger beetle larvae will eat them up as well. But the green tiger beetle is by no means scarce. It's quite a common species in the right habitat, but it's nonetheless a really beautiful thing. Also get some other lovely beetles as well, for things like the bee beetle, which is quite a scarce species unless you sort of live within sort of the west coast of Britain, particularly Wales and Scotland. And as you can see, it's very furry. It kind of gives it its name, the bee beetle or bee chafer. It's also got a bit of a patterning that's somewhat reminiscent of a bumblebee or a bee as well. But these develop, or the larvae of these develop in dead wood, particularly in birch, and you get quite a lot of birch trees on these colliery sites as well. So this is a species that does quite well on some sites. And other sort of beetles you get things like one of these pot beetles, so this is Cryptocephalus aureolus, which is a species that I would associate with sort of calcareous grassland, but you can find it on these colliery sites, and it really loves those yellow asteraceae again, where you'll see the adults actually sitting in the flower as it is here, but rather jewel-like, attractive looking things. Oil beetles have been a really interesting discovery in the last year. So violet oil beetle has been found on one site within my local area, which is pictured here. And in 2020, black oil beetles have also been found on Colliery Spoil site as well. So for those of you who don't know oil beetles, so oil beetles are cuckoos or kleptoparasites. They develop within the nest of solitary bees. So seeing these oil beetles obviously shows that there's really good populations of solitary bees present, which is really fantastic news. Also get other things that are associated with solitary bees as well, so things like bee fly. So as well as the dark edge bee fly, which is the more common one that you see in southern Britain, also get western bee fly, which is a nationally scarce species that you get, as the name suggests, in the west of Britain. So this is found on a number of sites locally to me. And you can see just how small they are. So this is one just pictured on my thumb. I don't have particularly massive fingers, and you can see how tiny it is, so really easily overlooked. Also get some really lovely hoverflies, and probably my favorite hoverflies are these microdon hoverflies. These are sort of large, dumpy hoverflies that develop within ants' nests. So ants do really well on these colliery sites because they like the open conditions and the hot ground conditions as well. So you get a number of ant-associated hoverflies, and one of these is these microdon species. Probably the most sort of specialist of the flies are these pygmy soldier flies. So this is Oxycera pygmaea, and these are associated with those two first springs that I talked about earlier. You've got a female here, egg laying directly in to this tufa, this calcium carbonate deposit. And there's a number of other specialist tufa associated hoverflies on these sites as well. Also get things like banded general soldier fly, so a nice big soldier fly that looks somewhat reminiscent of a hoverfly, but quite a scarce species, and is again associated with some of those seepages, not so heavily reliant on the tufa as the previous species, but still associated with those habitats. Also get varying other flies as well, so things like these tachinid flies. So this is Tachyna grossa, which is the largest tachinid fly in Europe. So it's quite sizable, almost sort of looking sort of bumblebee size or approaching, with sort of black with this yellow head, and these develop inside the caterpillars of a number of different moths particularly those that are found on sort of heathland habitats. This is another tachinid fly. This time this is Tachyna ursina, which is a lovely species that you see in early spring, so particularly in sort of March and April sort of time, and is a really good sign of spring. So once you've seen this species, then you definitely know it's sort of springtime, and they're rather furry and rather lovely little things that look like little teddy bears. Some really fantastic bugs have been found on these sites, and probably like some of the scarcer species that I found through my surveys have been true bugs. But this is one that's just one of my favourites. This is Hoplomachus stumbergii, a lovely species that's found on mouse-eared hawkweed. So if you know any areas for mouse-eared hawkweed, it's always worth looking for this species. And the adults sort of sit, well, and the larvae sit in the middle of the flower head. So they're quite easy to spot, though they are very small. I think they're only about sort of 4 millimeters long, so they can be easily missed. But quite a scarce sort of species. You also get sort of various grasshoppers, and probably the most iconic really is the mottled grasshopper. So this is one that really loves the dry ground conditions, the open bare ground on these sites. You often hear these singing their hearts out when you're out on these sites in the summer. Also get a variety of dragonflies as well, but the golden ring dragonfly is probably the one that's most commonly seen on these sites. So this is the UK's longest dragonfly, so it's quite a sizable thing. It tends to be very tame as well in many respects, so it'll often come and sort of land on you or sort of have a good look at you when you're out doing the survey work. So they're really amazing things. But probably the most scarce of all the species of dragonfly on these sites is this scarce blue-tailed damselfly. So this is a near threatened species. It's undergone a widespread decline and is considered a priority species for conservation. So this is a real nice one to have on a number of these colliery spoil sites in South Wales. Spiders are not a group that I've done much work on, but one particular species that's been turning up on a few sites in 2020 was the cricket bat orb-weaver spider. So you can see the markings on the abdomen look somewhat reminiscent of a cricket bat, and this is quite an uncommon species. So when I found it this year, have been new areas for it, which has been quite exciting, but a really attractive looking thing that you find on generally on sort of heathland habitats, but also on sort of low-growing scrub as well. Also get some rather nice harvestman, and probably the most interesting of which is this sabacon. So this is a species that was only found new to Britain back in 1980 on the Gower in South Wales, and has since spread throughout all of Wales, and is now in parts in England as well. It's believed to originate from the Pyrenees. And it's got these really quite amazing pedipalps at the front, so covered in these long hairs that they believe that they use that to mop up springtails or calendula. But millipedes have probably been the group that's revealed the most new species to Britain, as well as species new to science as well. So it's really quite an interesting area. So one of the species that was new to Britain was this one, which is the Bathe the Beast. This is that's one that was found at a colliery spoil site near Bather in Monmouth and Taff. Believed to be introduced, but not 100% sure. But at the moment, I've seen the only site in Britain for this rather sort of white, almost translucent little millipede. And then you've got another one here that's as yet unnamed. Is a species that was only found new to science from South Wales back in 2017. It's found on 5 sites at the moment, 4 of which are colliery spoil sites, and the 5th is quite close to a colliery spoil site as well. So that's quite fantastic that these new species are turning up on these sites. And then you also get some other wacky things, the things like the ghost slug, which is an amazing ghost white slug that lives underground where it feeds on earthworms. It's not believed to have any significant impact on earthworm populations. But it's a species that was only described new to science from South Wales back in 2008, but it's believed to originate from the Crimea region of Ukraine. So as well as the invertebrates, these sites are really important for things like adder, but also things like common lizard, slow worm, things like palmate newt, common frog, common toad. There's also interest beyond animals as well, so plants. So the plant communities can be particularly rich, particularly good for orchids, so things like bee orchids, pyramidal orchids, southern marsh orchids, and the list goes on as well there. So really fantastic places if you're really into orchids. Also a variety of other plant species as well, and one of my favorites is sheepspit scabious, which is really beautiful blue flowers, but really stunning things. And there's a huge variety of other plant species that can be found on these sites as well, including a number of more specialist species like sort of round-leaved wintergreen and things like that. Beyond the plants, there's also things like lichens that do really well on these sites, particularly the Cladonia lichens. There's a huge diversity of Cladonia lichens that can be found on these sites, and they're just absolutely stunning things once you've had a really good look at them, as you can see in these pictures here. And fungi are probably one of the really key groups on these sites. So as well as invertebrates, fungi support a huge number of rare and sort of scarce species. And there's work being done at the moment looking at the fungal communities on colliery spoil sites in South Wales, thanks to a lady called Emma Williams, who runs coal spoil fungi, which is an initiative just to raise awareness of the fungal value of colliery spoil sites. And she's recorded a huge diversity of fungi, some of which are pictured here, including a number that are new to Wales and new to the UK, and one that's also potentially new to science as well. So we're finding that they're really important sites for fungal conservation. So that was a bit of a guide through just some of the species and habitats that are found on these sites. Hopefully sort of emphasize how valuable these sites are to invertebrates, but also with the fungi, lichens and other animal groups as well. But unfortunately, these sites are under threat. So the threats are long and varied, and they include things like development for housing or industry, inappropriate reclamation or remediation of sites, inappropriate or absence of management as well. The planting of these sites for crop biofuels is a bit of an emerging threat. Also the use of these sites as an aggregate for the construction industry is another new threat that's emerging. The removal of these sites due to perceived safety risks is another threat to these sites, as is planting them up with conifer woodland, which has historically been the way to do things. And a large number of sites have been lost to commercial forestry by Welsh Government. And this continues to be a threat to the present day, and not just planting with coniferous woodland, but planting with broadleaf woodland as well. So unfortunately, as a result of all of these threats, they are a habitat that's unfortunately in decline. And sites are being lost on a yearly basis, and this is just one opposite my house is currently being developed at present. So even though our ecological knowledge of these sites is improving and we realize how important they are to the fungi and invertebrates and other things, they're still seen in quite a negative connotation. So people don't think of brownfield sites as being valuable for wildlife. So they're often the sites that are prioritized for any sort of development, even though they tend to be the most wildlife rich sites in the region. So regardless of how well nature's recovered these sites, there's still this pressure to do something useful with these sites. And that doing something useful could be development, or it could be planting them up with trees or so forth. So what should be seen as an ecological asset is still often viewed as a problem in need of fixing. And that is despite all of these amazing species I mentioned, and we're still turning up new species as well. So the Mardi monster millipede, for instance, is just one of those species. This is a millipede that was found new to science from Mardi Colliery, that's top of the Rhondda. And this sort of hit headlines across the UK and across the world as well. So this shows that, you know, there's brand new species to be found on some of these colliery spoil sites in South Wales, and how many more of these brand new species have we already lost due to our negative views on these sites and our pressure to really develop them or remove them completely. So really should be conserving these colliery spoil sites because they're fantastic habitats for wildlife that are unfortunately in decline. They are a refuge for rare and scarce species that are declining in the wider countryside. I believe that they act as stepping stones in the landscape. So as you can imagine, with all of these sorts of sites scattered throughout the valleys, they've got this sort of natural connectivity, so they're allowing species to move through the landscape, which is really important when it comes to climate change. They also help to fill the gap as well. So a lot of our more natural habitats would be much more fragmented if it wasn't for these colliery spoil sites that help to link them up. So they're hugely important in terms of the ecology, but their importance goes beyond that as well. So they also have geological importance for their access to fossils and minerals. And they do have some archaeological value as well. They're, I think, hugely important in terms of their social importance. So there will be sites that are, well used by local communities for recreation, which has obviously got associated benefits as well. And probably quite key also is the cultural and historical importance of these sites. So these are often the last remaining symbols of the coal industry, and they do form part of our cultural identity as South Walians, as I'm sure many of you in other coal mining regions of Britain would also feel the same. So we should be considering them as part of our cultural identity as well. And they're also useful visual cues in the landscape that can be used to tell sort of regional and local landscape stories as well. So just to summarize, colliery spoil is a regional resource that really does need conservation and further investigation. And I do believe that these are unique landscape features and sites of high biodiversity significance, and they really do deserve to be protected. If you'd like to find out any more information, feel free to visit my website, which is Colliery Spoil Biodiversity.wordpress.com. I've got some free to download resources on there, and this particular document, which is called the Invertebrate Conservation Value of Colliery Spoil Habitats in South Wales, is particularly useful because it's got lots of information about the history of these sites, how to manage these sites with invertebrates in mind in particular, but lots of useful information beyond invertebrates as well. And also I'd be quite keen if you could follow me on Facebook and also Twitter, and just help spread the message about how valuable these sites are, and hopefully help me sort of encourage people in other parts of the UK to get out on these sites and record what's there, whether that's invertebrates or plants or birds and so forth. So thank you very much for tuning in to the talk, and I hope you enjoyed, and do please get in touch with me if you want to find out any more about my work. Thank you very much.